Hi and welcome to Newswire LA. I'm your host, Chin Thomasangsi. Today we're standing on top of the West Boulevard Bridge in Mid-City, Los Angeles. This bridge is turning 80 years old this year and it's going to have a celebration. But this bridge has an unknown history. It's a bridge that links actually two parts of Los Angeles and also came about as the result of a horrific tragedy back in 1913. You want to know more? Stick around. We'll be right back after the credits. Hi and welcome to Newswire LA. I'm your host, Chin Thomasangsi. Again, we're here in Mid-City, Los Angeles, next to the West Boulevard Bridge. Last week, we heard extensively from Mitzi March-Mogul, who laid out the entire backstory of this bridge. This week, she'll tell us the stories that led to the building of this structure. And now, Mitzi March-Mogul. I want you to keep in mind that much of what you'll hear today took place between the years of 1912 and 1933. You can't help but realize that all of these factors and stories are much the same as what's being dealt with when it comes to today's Metro light rail line. We're talking about trains that are running across crowded streets. We're talking about subways leading everywhere, including the sea. And we're talking about various issues of life and the quality of life. You'll hear me say, time and again, that what's old is new again. Give us and I identified four, maybe there's one or two I missed, four main bullet points that led to the building of this particular bridge.
Well, the main one began with the creation of, well, I shouldn't say the main one, but we'll say the first one began with the development and opening of Lafayette Square, which is just to the south of us. And that occurred on September 22nd, 1912. They threw open the gates, quite literally the gates, and invited people to come and look and to purchase lots and build their homes there. And people did. Lots of movers and shakers, many names that people would be familiar with, and many that they wouldn't. But that didn't make them any less important in their time. And they had to get across these train tracks. And that was not so easy because there were about 300 trains a day running back and forth here. That's an extraordinary number. And there were actually small houses and buildings on what is now the south side of Venice Boulevard. It wasn't called Venice Boulevard then. It was 16th Street. And the train line was called the 16th Street line or the Venice Short Line. And the reason it was called the Venice Short Line was it was the short route to Venice, California, which had opened not too many years before, 1905, and was quite the resort and amusement park, and that's where people would go on the weekends and during the summer to have a good time.
A little bit like LA's version of Atlantic City, I guess.
Yes, it was very much like that, with a boardwalk and rides and dance hall and a plunge and all kinds of things. So it was a great place to go and have a good time for a day or a weekend. So this was really inconvenient for the residents of Lafayette Square. It cut them off from the developing communities to the north. Mid-Wilshire District, Hancock Park, Hollywood, Beverly Hills, because to get out was difficult. They had to kind of make a big circle and go around. And it was difficult for people to get in, like to make deliveries. And Lafayette Road was the access road, or the delivery road for Lafayette Square. But how were the delivery trucks meant to get across? July 13th, 1913, and this is really the biggie. And this is the story that none of us knew was there. It's a lovely midsummer day. People are out with their families and friends, their sweethearts and so on. They've gone to Venice for the day. And there are just masses of people. And so the train company had to put on some extra trains in order to get them all back. And the news accounts of the day talked about how many people, what a mad crush of people there were, all trying to get on the last train back, because they weren't all necessarily just going back into central Los Angeles. They had to make connections. They were going to Highland Park and Lincoln Heights and Pasadena and other outlying communities. So they had to make that connection to get that last train. It's dark. Picture it. There are no streetlights, because this is where we're standing. This is the end of the city. This is the western boundary. There's nothing. There's vineyards and bean fields and farms and so on, and there's really nothing till you get to Culver City, which was nothing but a whistle stop, and the Ivy substation, which is still there and has been repurposed. But that was it. So no street lights, no ambient light from businesses, because there are no businesses. It's just pitch black. Train number 1 comes into the station. This is Vineyard Junction. It's a huge junction, because from here, trains also went up San Vicente, going straight up to the town of Sherman, now West Hollywood. And Sherman was the railroad town, and that's where the car barns were, and they do the repairs and the cleaning, and it just all of the maintenance, everything was there. It was there when I was a kid growing up. So train number 1 is stopped at Vineyard Station, and they have a problem with one of the overhead rail lines. It's fallen. They've got to deal with that. So the train is in the station for longer than usual. People are getting out, they're milling around. It's still a very festive atmosphere. Train number 2 is on the approach. Train number 1 doesn't know it. Train number 2 doesn't know that train number 1 is still in the station. As they're on the approach, they fail to see that the motorman from train number 1 has begun to walk back to warn train number 2. He's swinging his lantern, and there's a slow board, and what that means in rail parlance, since I've become something of a lay expert, is it is literally a sign that says slow. There are no lights, no flashing lights like we're used to now, just a board that says slow. Difficult to see in the dark. And one little motorman with his lantern. The conductor doesn't see him. They don't slow down. They're coming into the station. They're only about, certainly less than 1,000 feet from the station. One account reports that there are a couple of young fellas on train number 1, and they're goofing off and figure they'll play a prank. Couldn't hurt anything. And so they pull the whistle a couple of times. Ah, says train conductor number 2, they must be pulling out. Not. And so the inevitable happened, and train number 2 collides with train number 1 still in the station, and they telescope. And it's a horrible scene, with people screaming, the sound of metal upon metal crashing and crunching, and it's dark, and people have been thrown around, and seats have come away from the floor, and people are buried under debris, and they can't find their loved ones, and they're injured, and some are dead, and it's just an awful scene.
It's Chatsworth of what we knew from a couple of years ago that happened in 1913.
It is exactly Chatsworth. And, you know, they say history repeats itself, and it does, especially where there are people involved, because no matter what kind of rules and regulations and precautions you may take, people are unpredictable. And so it is exactly Chatsworth, almost 100 years before.
One of the more interesting stories I read in your report, and you might remember it, was that there was a doctor who I think lived over on somewhere approximately in this area.
Dr. Henry MARXMILLER lived right up on 16th, overlooking the station. Now, from where we are here, the station itself was just beyond where the bridge is now located. He was up on 16th, what is now 16th Place, and he could see lights flashing, and he knew that something had happened with the electrical line. He saw it sparking, and then he heard the terrible crash, the noises, and so on, and he went running down, and for almost 2 hours, he was the only medical personnel on scene. And he used everything he had in his house to attend to the injured. He even took people back to his home to be able to administer to them there. In the end, 14 people died that night, and a 15th died the following day. Many hundreds more were injured. Altogether, there were about 1,000 people involved in this crash. The net result of the crash, to kind of cut to the chase here, was that everyone started looking at the safety of the trains, the safety of this particular situation, and the ways in which they could improve on those precautions. Everyone got involved, the city council, subcommittees, the State Railroad Commission. There were many hearings and so on. And eventually one of the main decisions made was that they would eliminate all grade crossings. Now, this is something else that we can kind of relate to today, most recently with the opening of the exposition line, where we have quite a few grade crossings. Now, I don't know whether that is a regulation that was then eliminated at some point in the past, whether it's simply been disregarded. I don't know the intricacies of that, but I do know that by 1915, they had eliminated all grade crossings throughout California, not just here in Los Angeles.
Wow. And that was all a result of what happened just a few feet past where we're standing right now.
That's exactly right.
Wow. What else brought this building into being?
Well, then we had, in 1917, everyone kind of took a break for a few years due to World War I, ran off and fought that battle. And then in 1917, they opened the brand new high school, Los Angeles High School, just a very short distance north from where we're standing. And that reopened the debate about the crossings, because they were then concerned about kids being able to cross safely. By 1920, they built a small wooden bridge across, and that was always intended to be temporary until they really got it together. So it took quite a long time for all of this to wend its way through the crazy process.
So I guess for people who think city government is bad now, it was just as bad then.
Oh, it's just as bad. It's always been bad. I mean, you read these old accounts of city council and the meetings and the things that they insisted on, and you think, well, truly some things never change. We all like to think of the good old days really being good old days, and I suppose in some respects there is a lot to take away from how people lived and behaved back then, but just as much, nothing has changed. It's only the underlying issues.
Wow, and hence we got this bridge. One of the things that I told you in my conversation with you the other night was how surprised I was about the architectural style of this particular bridge. It's considered to be Art Deco. And you told me something interesting that gave me thought that, we think of Art Deco or Italian Renaissance or whatever it is in one particular way. But when we create them, sometimes they're a hodgepodge and they drag in different elements of other architectural styles. Give us a little bit more thought on that.
Well, yeah, this is sort of Art Deco meets classical. And one of the great things about the Art Deco style is that I guess you could encapsulate it in one phrase, which was a title of a popular song of the day, which was, "Ain't We Got Fun?"
I love it.
And that was what Art Deco was all about. It was, unlike previous art movements before, in particular the arts and crafts that preceded it, it was really without philosophy. It didn't have a point to make. It just wanted to be. It wanted to express itself in whatever way was relevant to its location, wherever that was all over the world. And so this kind of followed that mid-30s monumentality of combining these classical elements, and it was used with public buildings, with banks, because 1933, 32 when it's being designed, but 33 when it opened, it's the depths of the Depression. And so they wanted to give people a sense of hope that things would get better, of solidity, that things would always be there and be strong for them. And so combining those two in particular just seemed natural to express the mood of the time.
And that really shows, like you said, in the different buildings that were thrown up at the time. And since we're talking about bridges, when you think about this bridge, you don't always think of the 6th Street Viaduct, the 7th Street Bridge, all of those more famous downtown bridges, but they were built in that same vein.
Yes, they were. And yeah, people think of those because they're bigger and sort of more grand. This is small, it's local, but it had the same reason for being and the same net effect as those bridges, which connected downtown with the entire east side of Los Angeles and made all kinds of things possible because of that connection. Here, we connected this part of central Los Angeles with more of the mid-city area that I previously mentioned, Beverly Hills, Wilshire, and Hancock Park, and Hollywood. Because the way the city developed, the great thing about Los Angeles was if you didn't like your neighborhood, you can just start your own somewhere. There was plenty of room for everyone. So you had Beverly Hills over here, and Hancock Park over here, and Hollywood doing its thing over here, and then little by little, they grew together and they connected themselves when the time was right for each one. And this bridge connected all of those kind of at the north end with all of these on the south end.
Wow. That's an amazing, amazing series. of elements that came together to build this one simple bridge. A lot of people, I would think, when they were watching this broadcast would say, well, why are we focusing on this one, and for some they would say this ugly piece of concrete, but it has a very varied history and it figures into the history of the city of Los Angeles.
Correct. And whether you think it's beautiful or ugly, I don't get into those kinds of adjectives because, let's say, art is personal. Some people love Picasso, some people can't stand him. And that's okay. We don't have to personally love something to appreciate what it is and what it represents. And that's the bigger takeaway here, I think. So whether you think it's a beautiful bridge or not is kind of beside the point.
And that's a good point to make. Well, let's talk about aesthetics. Having lived in this neighborhood as long as I have, 42 years, which is all my life, I do remember that there was a time when I think it was the city of Los Angeles had considered taking those lights off of their poles and replacing them with something else. Luckily at that time, I believe the people in the various areas got together and saved those lights.
It's often, preservation quite literally begins at home. And the people who live near a particular monument, whether it's a building or a bridge or perhaps a significant grove of trees or a single tree, almost anything can qualify if it meets the standards for designation, because that's part of who they are as neighbors, as a community. It's part of their neighborhood, and they have a right to keep that. That's their heritage and their legacy, as well as the people who originally built it. So I think that's really important to remember, that monuments like this bridge have a very personal connection to people like you who have grown up kind of in the shadow of it, didn't necessarily know the backstory, and I'm not sure that it was absolutely necessary to know that. Now, as an adult, you see things differently, and so you appreciate it on a different level. But if you had never heard the story, you would still love this bridge. It's part of who you are.
I completely agree. I completely agree.
I also, by the way, love the arch of this bridge that is higher on the north end than it is on the south, and that was to accommodate the height of the trains. I think that's a charming note.
And it's a throwback to another time when there were trains actually running through Los Angeles. And I think earlier when we were talking about it, we're dealing with all those same things again. Back in the old days, it was the yellow car, the red car, the green car. Today, it's the red line, it's the yellow line, it's the blue line that runs into Long Beach. Again, I think I said it earlier in the interview, everything that is old is new again.
Absolutely true.
Now, tell me about the new protections this building now has. Now, I'm going to ask you one of the questions that's probably going to clear it up for a lot of people.
Okay.
There are very few alterations there are no alterations that can be done to this bridge without the approval of several different bodies.
Yes. Should there be any changes, whether they want to paint it or add colorful baskets of flowers or anything, there is a process of application. It will get reviewed first by the staff of the Office of Historic Resources. It will then be referred to the Cultural Heritage Commission. The public will have a chance to testify and offer their opinions. Probably the Bureau of Engineering would be the lead agency on this bridge, and they would present whatever information they felt was relevant. But ultimately, it would be up to the Cultural Heritage Commission to decide whether or not those things would comport with its designation. That's not to say monuments are not meant to be like a fly in amber. It's not that you can't ever change anything, but the important thing is to maintain the integrity of whatever that monument is, whether it's a building, a house, a bridge, or even a tree. Trees clearly need to be pruned now and then in order to keep them healthy. So it's not like saying, oh, well, we've made a landmark out of this tree, and so you can never cut off a branch. It's, it doesn't work that way. So, but whatever changes are made must be done with great sensitivity and looking at the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and restoration.
Now that this historic cultural monument is done, what do you take away from this whole experience?
Well, for me, this bridge as a monument has a double meaning, because not only is it our monument now as what it is, a bridge, but it's kind of the ultimate monument to those 15 people who died that July 1913. They gave their lives unwillingly, certainly, but in the end, a lot of positive things came out of it, including the fact that we have this, what I consider to be a very lovely local bridge. And some of those people were shipped back home for burial. Some of them are buried right here locally. One is buried in the Rosedale Cemetery. So they, in the end, were kind of scattered to the four winds. But when you think about the story and that fateful night, in a way, their spirit, the spirit of those 15 people, is right here with this bridge where they died.
And on that note, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, thank you.
And that's it for our look at the West Boulevard Bridge in Mid-City Los Angeles. We're finding out that many of the things we see each and every day have a historic and cultural significance. With people like Mitzi March Mogul among us, we're going to make sure that those stories are not lost in the sands of time. And that's it for this broadcast of Newswire LA. I thank you for joining us. And as always, for everything Newswire LA, look us up on Facebook and Twitter at Newswire LA. I'm your host, Chin Thomasangsi, saying good night, and we'll see you back here next time. Stay tuned for more news on this Westlake Signal station.